The boy looked up at the towering building, heart pounding, and whispered to himself, "She doesn't even know I exist, but she's my mother." The revolving doors spun open, and Jalen stepped inside Whitmore Health Systems, a fortress of glass and steel that seemed to hum with wealth, power, and indifference. His sneakers squeaked softly on the polished floor as he clutched a worn manila folder to his chest. The receptionist barely glanced at him until she noticed the seriousness in his eyes. "I'm here to see Clara Jean Whitmore," he said, voice small but clear. "She doesn't do walk-ins, sweetheart." He didn't blink. "Tell her her son is here." Those words traveled up the building faster than any elevator. On the 27th floor, Clara Whitmore stood by her window, her tall frame still as glass, her blonde hair gathered loosely in a low twist that spilled gently onto her shoulders. She wore a navy sheathed dress that accentuated her slender figure, sharp heels, and the look of someone used to control. The kind of woman who could silence a room with one glance, and often did. Her assistant Miranda knocked, eyes wide. "There's a boy downstairs. He said he's your son." Clara turned. "Excuse me?" "He said his name is Jalen Carter." Everything inside her went still. Everything inside her fell silent. A strange ache clenched in her chest. Sharp, unexplained, and deeply familiar. It wasn't that she was avoiding the truth. It had just been so long. She couldn't quite believe her own ears. Before we dive deeper into the story, may I ask, where are you watching from? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one of our stories. That name, Carter. It was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 9 years. Not since Marcus walked out of her life, holding a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket. He'd said nothing as he left, but his eyes had screamed of betrayal, of heartbreak, of being broken by a world that hated the color of his skin and punished the woman who loved him. Clara hadn't fought back. She let him go. Because back then she was too ambitious, too afraid, and too white. Miranda cleared her throat. "Should I send him away?" "No," Clara said. "Bring him up." When the elevator doors slid open minutes later, Clara stood frozen in place. The boy stepped in. Maybe 9 years old. Light brown skin, high cheekbones, hazel eyes, her eyes. He wore a hoodie, a size too big, jeans worn at the knees, and carried a backpack that looked ready to fall apart. But he stood with a strange composure, like someone much older than his years. He looked at her like he already knew everything. "I'm Jalen," he said, "Marcus Carter's son." Clara's knees almost buckled. He walked to her desk and placed the manila folder down. "He's sick, real sick. He said I should come find you." Clara couldn't breathe. "Where is he?" "In Atlanta. He's in a clinic. Said he didn't have much time left." I don't understand," she stammered. "Why didn't he?" "He said you made your choice." Clara opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a single photo. Marcus, older now, but still proud, holding baby Jalen on the front steps of a rundown duplex. The baby wore a tiny onesie that read, "My mommy's strong. My daddy's stronger." There was no smile on Marcus's face, only resolve. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Why now?" Jalen didn't answer right away. Then he said, "He told me I didn't need both parents. That love was enough, but I think he lied. I think I still need you." She wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came. Her entire world had tilted off its axis. "I didn't know," she finally whispered. "I know," Jalen said. "That's why I came." He turned to go. "Wait," she said. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Why did he send you?" Jalen turned his head just slightly. "Because he wanted you to see what you missed. And because he still loves you, even if you don't deserve it." Then he walked out. Clara stood alone in her glass tower, her reflection trembling on the polished floor. Her hands gripped the edges of her desk. Her lips parted. Her breath hitched. And for the first time in 9 years, Clara Jean Whitmore, millionaire, CEO, the woman who never cried, felt her soul break wide open. A child had walked into her world, not with anger, but with the truth. And the truth was a son. Brian, the elevator closed behind him, and Clara just stood there, unmoving. The glass walls of her office reflected a woman who no longer recognized herself. 9 years ago, she made a decision. One she never said out loud, never wrote in any diary, but one that haunted her every time she passed a child with hazel eyes. She had told Marcus the timing wasn't right. The world wasn't ready. She wasn't ready. And he didn't argue. He just held their baby and left. She never saw either of them again, until today. She walked slowly to her private lounge and opened the bottom drawer of a walnut cabinet she hadn't touched in years. Tucked beneath old documents and a forgotten bottle of aged scotch was a small creased envelope. Inside was the letter Marcus had slipped into her coat pocket the night before he disappeared. She had never read it. Until now. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. His handwriting was unmistakable, messy but musical, each letter carrying weight. "Clara, if you're reading this, then maybe part of you still cares. Maybe part of you remembers what we were before fear took over. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because our child deserved more than silence, more than shame, more than being treated like a stain. If you ever decide you're brave enough to look back, just know we never stopped loving you." Her chest ached. She folded the letter gently, almost reverently, and set it on her desk. The photo Jalen had left stared up at her. His eyes, those unmistakable hazel eyes, were a mirror she couldn't avoid anymore. She didn't go to her afternoon meetings. She didn't return her assistant's texts. Instead, she pulled up a private browser and began searching. Marcus Carter Atlanta Clinic. Nothing specific. Then she added the words hospice, terminal, single father. Her hands moved faster than her thoughts. She scanned images, narrowed locations, cross-checked with the return address on the envelope Jalen had dropped. By nightfall, she found him. A modest hospice on the outskirts of Atlanta. No press, no funding, just a basic listing. St. Lucia Care Center. Accepting Medicaid. Donations appreciated. She sat back in her chair and stared out at the glittering skyline of Houston. Every tower looked hollow. Every light seemed cold. She had built this empire, brick by brick, but had left something far more important behind. At 11:17 p.m., she picked up her phone and called her driver. "We're flying to Atlanta in the morning." The next day, Clara arrived at the hospice without a bodyguard, without makeup, and without her usual steel confidence. She wore a gray cashmere sweater, jeans, and flats. Her blonde hair was tied back simply. She didn't want to be a CEO here. She wanted to be someone human. The nurse at the front desk recognized her immediately. "Ms. Whitmore, you're really here?" Clara nodded. "I'd like to see Marcus Carter." The woman hesitated. "He's not in great shape today. I'm not sure he's lucid." "I don't need him to speak," Clara said. "I just need to see him." The room was small and dim. the air filled with the scent of antiseptic and lavender. Marcus lay on a narrow bed, thinner than she remembered, his once musician hands now frail and spotted. But his face, still his face. Older, worn, but undeniable. She stood in the doorway for a long time, unable to step closer. Memories crashed through her like a wave. His laugh, his trumpet in the park, the way he once whispered, "I love you, even if the world says I shouldn't." Finally, she stepped forward and sat beside him. "I'm here, Marcus," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I met our son. He found me. And he's amazing." His eyelids fluttered slightly. She reached out and touched his hand, just gently enough not to startle him. "You were right," she said softly. "About all of it. I was scared. I let them win. I let me win." A tear slid down her cheek. He didn't open his eyes, but his fingers tightened around hers, barely, but undeniably. And in that quiet, failing room, Clara Jean Whitmore broke into 1,000 silent pieces. She had spent 9 years building walls, and in one afternoon, a boy she never got to raise had torn them all down. Tomorrow, she would tell the world nothing had changed. But tonight, in the presence of a dying man, and a truth too long buried, everything already had. Clara returned to Houston 2 days later, physically present but emotionally elsewhere. Her office felt colder, more sterile, as if the walls had overheard her confession beside Marcus's bed. She walked past her assistant without speaking, dropped her handbag, and sat at her desk. The manila folder was still there, Jalen's resume. It wasn't even a real resume, just a child's attempt at proving he had value. Under skills, he had written, "I can cook eggs. I never miss homework. I don't cry in front of people." Clara traced the uneven pencil marks with her finger. The board meeting was in 20 minutes. They were expecting quarterly numbers and capital projections. What they weren't expecting was a woman who had just watched the love of her life die in a bed smaller than the coat closet in this very building. As she stepped into the conference room, 12 people fell silent. Her usual entrance was precise. Heels, clipboard, a direct gaze. Today, she carried no papers, only the folder. "Before we begin," she said, voice steady but low, "I want to talk about something personal." A few executives exchanged nervous glances. "Many of you know I was born and raised in Birmingham," she continued. "Few of you know I fell in love at 17 with someone the world told me I shouldn't." She opened the folder, slid the sheet across the table. "This is Jalen Carter. He's 9 years old, and he's my son." Gasps weren't audible, but they were there in the shifting bodies and tightened jaws. One board member, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, stared at the paper as if it might catch fire. "Ms. Whitmore," she began carefully, "I'm not sure how this is relevant to." "It's relevant because I've spent my entire career pretending that love and legacy don't intersect," Clara said, "and I was wrong." She stepped to the head of the table, spine straight, voice rising. "I met Jalen 2 days ago. His father, Marcus Carter, was dying. He didn't send me a lawsuit. He sent me a child, not to demand anything, but to remind me that silence doesn't erase responsibility." Someone cleared their throat. Another scribbled a note they clearly didn't want seen. Clara pressed forward. "This company bears my name. But if it's going to mean anything, it has to start being more than polished marble and quarterly growth. It has to mean making room for stories that were pushed aside. Stories like mine. Like his." She placed a second photo on the table, her and Marcus years ago, laughing beneath a summer sun. This was before I let fear choose for me. The room went still. No one interrupted. Clara looked down the table, directly at Margaret. You once told me that justice isn't always fair, but it should always be brave. I'm asking you to be brave now. Margaret said nothing, but her eyes softened. Clara took a breath. I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. I've already filed the papers. Murmurs surged. One man tried to speak, but she raised a hand. This isn't a scandal. This is a story, and I intend to tell it the right way. She walked out of the room without waiting for approval. In her hand, she still held the drawing Jalen had once shown her. 3 stick figures, hand in hand, under a crooked sun. On the sidewalk outside, her car waited, but she didn't get in. She called Jalen instead. Pack a bag, she said gently. You're coming home with me. His voice on the other end was quiet, uncertain. Are you sure? Clara smiled, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. In a tower built from ambition and isolation, Clara had finally done something not for power, not for control, but for love. And in doing so, she became something she never thought she'd get the chance to be. A mother. The plane landed just after midnight. Clara stepped onto the tarmac, not in heels or a tailored suit, but in sneakers and a hoodie borrowed from her assistant's teenage son. She looked like any tired traveler, but inside, every nerve felt like it was fraying. Jalen slept curled up beside her on the flight, his head on her shoulder, the drawing still folded in his pocket. He hadn't said much since their call. He didn't need to. Some truths didn't require words to be understood. The hospice was dimly lit and nearly silent when they arrived. The night nurse on duty gave her a gentle nod and gestured toward the hallway. Marcus's door was half open. The soft whir of machines filled the room. The man who once filled jazz clubs with rhythm and soul now lay motionless, sunken into the thin mattress, his chest rising in slow, shallow intervals. Clara stepped inside with Jalen close behind her. She took Marcus's hand, cool and fragile. His fingers barely twitched in response. Marcus, she whispered, we're here. Jalen's here. Jalen stood at the foot of the bed, frozen. For a moment, he seemed too young, too small to carry the weight of this moment. Then he stepped forward and reached out for his father's hand, placing it gently between both of his. I told you I'd find her, he said. I did it, Dad. Marcus's eyes didn't open, but a tear rolled down the side of his face. The nurse entered quietly, placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. He hasn't spoken since yesterday. He's close. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. She sat beside him, brushing a strand of gray hair from his forehead. You were right, about everything. I let fear win, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. They stayed like that through the night. No grand speeches, no dramatic final words, just a family in a room, fractured, imperfect, healing. At dawn, Marcus exhaled one final breath, a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for music. His hand slipped from theirs. Jalen didn't cry, not right away. He just held on, as if refusing to let go could somehow undo what had just happened. Clara wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly to her chest. It's okay, she whispered into his hair. You're not alone anymore. The funeral was small, just Clara, Jalen, the nurse, and 2 of Marcus's old bandmates who had driven from Macon in a rusted van. They played one last tune at the gravesite, a slow, aching melody that rose into the air like smoke. Clara didn't speak at the service. Jalen did. My dad said music was the sound of feelings you couldn't say out loud. I guess that's why he didn't talk much. He just played. And I hope, wherever he is now, he knows I heard him. Afterward, they returned to the hospice to gather Marcus's things. There wasn't much. A few shirts, a worn saxophone case, a journal with water-stained pages. Clara opened it gently. Inside were half-written songs, sketches of old concert halls, and one entry dated 9 years ago. She didn't come after me, but I still hope she will one day. If she does, I'll be ready to forgive her. Clara pressed the journal to her chest. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered. "I should have come sooner." But even as the grief weighed down on her, there was light. Jalen stood in the doorway, saxophone case in hand. "Can I learn?" he asked. She smiled through her tears. "You already are." As they walked back to the car, the sunrise bathed the parking lot in gold. It was a new day without Marcus, but not without the echoes of who he had been. Clara looked down at her son and reached for his hand. "Let's go home," she said. And this time, she meant it. Weeks passed, but Clara no longer counted time in board meetings or stock fluctuations. Her days were now measured by the rhythm of Jalen's footsteps running through her house, by the soft notes of a saxophone scale played off-key in the early morning, and by the rare but growing sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. Houston had never felt like home, until now. Clara had cleared out the formal guest room and turned it into Jalen's space. Posters of jazz legends hung beside photos of science fair projects and math awards. His backpack rested on the chair, where once only tailored suits had hung. The house had stopped being a monument to ambition and started becoming a place of memory and movement. One afternoon, as Clara stood in her kitchen stirring a pot of soup, a recipe her mother used to make, Jalen walked in holding a sheet of paper. "What's this?" she asked, wiping her hands. "I wrote a speech," he said, not meeting her eyes. "They're doing a school assembly on people who changed our lives. I picked Dad, but I want you to hear it first." Clara sat at the table, her chest already tightening. Jalen began to read, his voice small but certain. "My dad wasn't famous, but he was strong. He never complained, even when he was sick. He taught me that music is for feelings you don't know how to say, and that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's proof you're brave. I used to think I didn't need a mom, but now I know I just hadn't met her yet." Clara's throat closed. She reached across the table and took his hand. "You didn't have to write that last part," she whispered. "I didn't write it for you," Jalen said with a shy smile. "I wrote it for me." Later that week, Clara made a public announcement. Not at a press conference, not through a PR firm, but in the community center down the block from Marcus's old hospice. She stood before a crowd of local families, donors, teachers, and healthcare workers. No designer suit, no teleprompter. Just her, a microphone, and the truth. "I stepped down from my company because I realized power means nothing if it can't be used to lift others," she said. "Today I'm launching the Carter Whitmore Foundation. We'll fund scholarships for children who've lost parents, provide instruments for music programs, and support hospice care centers, like the one that gave my son's father dignity in his final days." The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A man in the back nodded with quiet approval. Jalen sat beside the stage, saxophone in his lap, beaming with a pride too big for his small frame. After the event, as they walked through the parking lot, Clara asked, "What do you think Dad would have said about all this?" Jalen thought for a moment. He probably would have said, "You're finally listening to the music." She laughed, the sound light and strange in her mouth. "Maybe I am." That night, they sat on the back porch, fireflies blinking in the shadows, Jalen playing slow notes that floated into the humid Texas air. Clara closed her eyes, the melody wrapping around her like a second chance. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. And for a woman who had built a kingdom from stone and silence, the greatest thing she ever created was a home. The morning of the school assembly was crisp and clear, sunlight pouring through the windows like a silent blessing. Clara stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the collar of her blouse, not because she cared how she looked, but because she hadn't been this nervous since her first investor pitch 20 years ago. Jalen was already in the car, wearing his best button-up shirt and clutching his saxophone case like it was armor. On the drive to the school, they didn't speak much, but there was no need to. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It was full of quiet understanding, the kind that only forms between people who've lost something and found each other in the rubble. The auditorium was packed. Parents filled the folding chairs, teachers lined the walls, and students whispered in excitement. Clara sat in the second row, heart pounding. When Jalen's name was called, he walked onto the stage with a slow, confident stride, the kind she hadn't seen in him before Marcus died. He adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and began. "My name is Jalen Carter, and this is for the person who taught me what love sounds like." He lifted the saxophone, and the first notes floated out, hesitant, tender, imperfect. But as he played, the melody deepened. It was a song Marcus once wrote but never recorded, something Clara had heard only once, long ago, on a lazy afternoon in Atlanta, when love still felt possible. Now it filled the room like sunlight. No one moved, no one breathed. When he finished, there was a beat of silence, then a wave of applause. Not polite, not obligatory, real. Clara stood and clapped, tears slipping down her face. A woman beside her whispered, "That boy, he's special." Clara turned, smiled, and said softly, "He's mine." After the assembly, as families mingled outside, Jalen tugged at her hand. "I want to change my name," he said. "Can I be Jalen Whitmore Carter?" She froze, not from doubt, but from the weight of what that meant. A name, a bond, a decision he wasn't forced into, but chose for himself. She knelt beside him, cupping his cheek. "You can be anything you want. And that name? It sounds perfect." That weekend, they visited Marcus's grave. Jalen placed a small stone saxophone figurine on the headstone. Clara added a folded paper with the foundation's new logo, his name beside hers. They stood in silence for a moment, letting the wind carry everything that didn't need to be said. Before they left, Jalen looked up. "Do you think he knows?" Clara nodded, her voice steady. He always knew. As they walked back to the car, hand in hand, the camera of life didn't zoom out to some grand cityscape or dramatic skyline. It stayed with them, a woman who once believed love would destroy her future, and a boy who proved that love was the only future worth building. She hadn't just regained a son. She had redefined who she was. Not CEO, not heiress, not Whitmore, just Mom.